Shalom to everyone, and I say shalom, that is a neutral word because we are across almost every time zone in the world. There are those that are seeing us in the morning and in the noon and in the afternoon and even night. We have participants from all across the globe, from my native Buenos Aires to Sydney, Australia, and from New York, where I am currently sitting, to Paris, France. I am Dani Dayan, the Consul General of Israel to New York, and this is a bittersweet occasion for me, a bittersweet occasion because I expected to host this event marking the launching of my good friend Irina Nevzlin's new and impressive book in my residence in person. But many things changed in the world during the last weeks, and we are meeting. That's the bitter part of the story, only online through Zoom. Thank God, thank God for inventing the Zoom. Otherwise, we would have been really lost during this time. For me, it's a very personal occasion also because my connection to the Museum of the Jewish People in Beit HaTfutzot is, for me, personal. I love Beit HaTfutzot. I love the Museum of the Jewish People, and I even celebrated there. My wife and I celebrated there our daughter's bat mitzvah quite a few years ago. This is the largest Jewish museum in the world when it will open again in October, full-fledged, and it's a must-see when you come to Israel. It's also endorsed by a special law that was legislated by the Israeli Knesset. We are going to talk about identity. Irina's new book, The Impact of Identity, The Power of Knowing Who You Are. And I think that these days, in the entire world, for sure, in the United States, but also in Israel and elsewhere, identity is one of the most important words to understand the days we are going through. For me, the identity, Jewish identity in my case, is central to my being. I am one of those that for them Judaism is not a set of rituals necessarily, or liturgy or things of that sort. For me, Judaism is first and foremost an identity, an identification as such. I would even say that I developed my personal definition of who is a Jew. You know, who is a Jew? Mihu Yehudi in Hebrew is one of the issues that have been most hotly debated in the Jewish world, in America, in Israel, in the relations between the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community. It's an issue that even toppled governments in Israel. For me, a Jew is a person that every single year around October, when the Nobel Prizes awardees are announced, looks how many Jews are in the list. If you do that, you are either a Jew or an anti-Semite. On the lehavdil, as we say in Hebrew, when a catastrophe happens, an aircraft crashes, you look how many Jewish names are in the list. If you do that, you are a Jew. That's, of course, a very simplistic way to define an identity, but a very empiric one. I really have a great honor to host virtually this event because two very good friends, but not only good friends, persons that I admire very much, their activity, will be conducting what I am sure will be an extremely interesting discussion. First and foremost, Irina Nevzlin, the chair of the board of directors of the Museum of the Jewish People at Beit HaTfutzot, She now leads the extensive renewal project to recreate Beit HaTfutzot as a unique cultural center for the world Jewry, for the Jewish people. She is obviously the author of the book, the extremely interesting book we are going to talk about. She's also the founding co-chair of the Israeli Center for Better Childhood, and she's involved in strategic planning forums, bringing together the private and the non-private sectors for positive change in social policy in Israel. I think that Irina is a visionary. I think that Irina is a unique voice in Israel and in world Jewry in identifying correctly, in my view, the needs of the Jewish people and how we should address them. I find myself agreeing so much with Irina on these issues that, yeah, I think she's right. If I agree with her, obviously, I think she's right. Leading the conversation with Irina will be another good friend of mine, also from my days in Israel, Ethan Bronner, today a senior editor in Bloomberg, focused in international politics, but Ethan spent 17 years at the New York Times. Should also I say, Ethan, that I admire the New York Times? I'm not sure. Where he was the Jerusalem bureau chief, he was a deputy foreign editor, deputy national editor. Actually, it was his third tour in Jerusalem when he was there for the New York Times, because he was also there for the Boston Globe and for Reuters. He's a graduate of the Wesleyan University and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. I think it's the Pulitzer School, right? And his wife, Naomi, is an Israeli-born psychologist. They have two grown sons. One of them served in the IDF, an issue, something that became a kind of an issue, both in Israel and I think in 42nd Street, not only in Israel. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Dani. Thank you very much. Irina, it's great to see you again. Dani, it's always good to see you. I knew Dani when he was not yet Consul General. So, Irina, we're here to talk about identity in the throes of crisis. Let me start out by saying that in this crisis that we're in the middle of, things are a little different than they've typically been for Jews, at least in Israel and in the United States. Typically, American Jews look at Israel and they feel a sense of solidarity. They have a sense of the sacrifice and the difficulties that Israelis face, but they sort of feel that they're in a little bit better position. In coronavirus, I think that things went better in Israel than they did in the United States. And in some ways, there is a crisis here that's more profound than there. And I'm wondering whether, as you look at the two places, how you compare the sense of crisis.
First of all, thank you very much, Dani, Ambassador Dayan, and for Center for Jewish History and for all the teams to making it happen. I'm still pretty excited because I'm very new, as all of us, to this Zoom thing. And as you said, it's bitter and sweet. We can all meet finally, but it's only online. And thank you for everyone for joining. I'm sure in the middle of the day in New York and everywhere in the world, it's not easy in the life that we have. Ethan, I think that, first of all, I think that the good news is, as I'm always with the good news, is that Jews deal with crisis really, really well. I think we have 5,000 of years of knowing how to survive and how to be resilient. So if we look at the Jewish people all around, I'm hoping that we're all, and the crisis is at the scale that I think none of us can imagine. I was trying to compare it in my head to other things, and I will say something maybe not very difficult to say, but even the World War II was focused in limited territories, though a horrible crisis, especially for the Jewish people, but it was limited in the geographical. And now we're suddenly in the crisis where we finally can see how global the world is. Now, in terms of the two groups, it's really hard for me to compare because you are there in New York and you'll have to enlighten us on what's going on because we don't feel it from Israel. But I think first of all, for Israel, it was amazing to see that there are two sides of the story. So one is that Israel is very united and proud in how we have dealt with the crisis, considering how much we always search for political divide and complain about the situation. Actually, as much as we complain, we can see that in terms of the numbers and in terms of the fact that we got back to normal life, we have dealt very, positively, effectively. We'll see. Years will tell what was going on actually, but for now, that's how it seems. I think that in terms of the Israeli society, it was, again, bitter and sweet, as Dani said. The sweet part is that we are united and we feel proud. The difficult side, and I think it's the same, maybe the same reasons in United States, is that any crisis like that increases what we had before that, and that's xenophobia, and that's racism, and that's incitement, and that's hate, because somehow the negative travels much quicker and spreads much quicker. And of course, this divide that we feel in the society and this need to blame the other or to feel that the other is wrong, we can feel it with the Haredi community and with the Arab community. But I think overall, the situation in the world, it takes the good. It could take the good out of all of us, but unfortunately, it also takes the worst.
So I want to get to your book in a minute, but you raised a couple of topics that I also want to get to. So let's start maybe there. It's interesting you said that the crisis brings out the worst. Because in an odd way, what I was getting to in my first question was that it feels to me like in some ways Israel, it actually helped it in two ways. Well, and I wanted to ask you to talk about them. Of course, the relationship between Jews and Arabs, Palestinians of Israeli citizenship, if you prefer, is always complicated. The sense I have watching from here is that this is the first existential crisis that Israel has faced that did not involve a threat from Arabs, right? From the brothers or cousins of those living there. And that the large representation of Arabs in the medical community in Israel has been a very positive factor in how Jews and Arabs feel toward one another. Do you tell us a little bit about whether I'm misunderstanding? And if I'm right, tell me a little more about it.
I have to say, before you started talking, I was thinking, you said you reflect because what you get is from the news, obviously. Imagine what the power of media is now, considering that the only way you can get the information is from the conversations with people and the news. You can't actually jump on the plane and come and see it for yourself. And that's something to not to forget about, long term. I think you are right. I think in terms of we can't blame each other in the current situation, and we're more united than ever. I think if you take Haredi community, actually, you will get, because people anyway search to blame some other group than themselves, and that's very unfortunate for me, but that's the way the human nature is. I think with the Haredi community, we saw a very, it's a complicated matter where you see from one hand, because of the outbreak in Bnei Brak and because of the number of COVID patients in the Haredi community, you could see that it's the mixed attitude. Because on one hand, people understand that the information doesn't get to the Haredi community and the rules don't get to the Haredi community in the way that it does for the communities which are more open to media and other outlets. On the other hand, people are searching for someone to blame, right? So I think you are right, it's fascinating. It's not Jews and Arabs for a change, which is refreshing. I think we don't know how to react to that. However, we do search whom to blame, unfortunately.
On the Haredi thing, I think you're right. But so again, you're right. I'm reliant on reports, and a report I saw impressed me. And so tell me if I'm placing too much emphasis on it. On the one hand, what you say is what I understood, which is that people attacked the Haredi community for not getting in line quickly on this issue. But on the other hand, I saw Haredim after the IDF was sent into Bnei Brak to help I heard a Haredi who was interviewed saying, we've been taught to hate these people my whole lives, and here they are saving our lives. And I thought, wow, I mean, maybe not only are Jews and Arabs getting together in an unusual way in this COVID thing in Israel, but there could be something positive in the Haredi in secular relationship.
You know, it's interesting that all the paradigms that we believed in, who you should love and who you should hate and who is your people and who is not your people, is something that is being crushed immediately now, because we have never lived in the time when the paradigms that we knew were not, were not what we thought anymore. If anyone would ask me about what would be the safest place on earth to be for a Jewish person, for me personally, to spend in pandemic, I will definitely say New York as the first reaction, because that will be where I'll say I have the most doctors, I'll know the most people, the system will work. It's not like Israel where everything is, I mean, the process is not our strong side, right? And it requires a lot of systematic process and planning in crisis. So I think you are very right. We'll see the results of that, but it's a question of where people take it. You could take it to the hate and to racism. You can also take it to starting to understand that maybe what the prejudice that you had and the ideas that you had about the other, maybe they're not all that right, and maybe you are just, you used to believe things. However, for someone in a grown-up age to start to question all your beliefs and paradigms, I think is a very refreshing exercise, which I believe can bring out a lot of good.
So that makes me ask the still even broader question beyond Jews and Israel, which is that in a lot of parts of the world, this has been such a profound crisis that people are asking themselves whether their basic beliefs and values need to be rethought in the face of what is going on. Do you have the feeling that, and I know none of us really knows, but you're a smart person, I'm curious to hear what you think, whether COVID is sort of forcing all of us to rethink our most basic values and possibly shift them?
I think that it happens, and it happens whether you like it or not. I think there are people that will try to go to the comfort of their beliefs and prove themselves that they are right again, but it will not happen. I think it's so much bigger than us, and also the fact that, in fact, you have a silent enemy, and we're all united against this silent enemy, which frankly none of us understands, that less so the doctors, which we hope will. I think it goes back to the question that we all came here to discuss, which is ultimately you have this ability now, or whether you want it or not, to turn in and ask yourself questions. Now, narrative that you're going to tell yourself is very much dependent on what you told yourself before, right? So in other words, if I knew what my identity was and I was used to asking myself those questions, then I have some kind of strong narrative that I can build on, right? And ask new questions, because, people are so much used to define themselves by the outside world, right? People are so much used to not thinking they can be depressed and not have meaningful life because they have a work that they go to every day, or that they, a sportsman that defines himself from the marathon runner who all his life is training for marathon and now runs one, right? So he used to feel that he or she is a very happy person, and now we're confined in the walls. They don't have marathons anymore. So I think that this is a unique opportunity for some internal assessment, whether you are going to come out of that stronger because you have tools to do that or not. I think that comes down to the question of how much conversation with yourself about your identity you had before.
I think that's a great point. And I will just say as a preface to this next question that in a certain way, this is a first world conversation, because a lot of what I'm overseeing now is our coverage of how COVID is affecting poor countries. And then they're, of course, not in a position to shelter the way we are and to re-ask questions, basic values, but simply to try to survive. But moving past that to the world that we fortunately inhabit. So what you said goes directly to your book, I think, the book, The Impact of Identity, which seeks to ask about yourself, about your own voyage. And so why don't you talk a little bit about what motivated you to write it and how it how the various parts of your journey from the Soviet Union to London to Israel fit in?
So first I'll say that I know there are a couple of my friends on the call. I hope there are a couple, at least I hope they are. And they can testify to the fact that if a year ago you would ask me that whether I'm going to write a book, they'll definitely say that they never heard that this will occur in her mind. And I think that it's the journey that brought me to write it. I didn't quite see myself as an author. By the way, somebody will help me a lot. It's an identity question. When I started writing it, I was very much hoping that I'll be able to be like you, Ethan. I'll, sit in the morning, open the computer, see the blank page, and write it. And then somebody smart explained to me the difference between writer and author. So I did have an idea, however, how to do that. That was a difficult process. I was born, I'm Russian. You can still hear by the accent, my Russian accent, it's hard to, it's one of those American Russian, it's hard to hide. I was born in Russia, and I was born minority in quite an anti-Semitic environment, not publicly anti-Semitic. I was born in 1978, but anyway, the environment was, the DNA of the Russian Federation is such. It was not explained to me on any level by my family that we have something Jewish and that all the family is Jewish, because simply for the safety reasons. I found out that I was Jewish because I was called a very derogatory term on the street by some drunk in our very humble neighborhood. And then all my life was the process of the moment somebody tells you that you are different, you have to deal with that, right? You don't have a choice of not dealing with that, because what does it mean that I'm not like the others? So I think for me, the book and the museum, by the way, is a culmination of the process that I was just simply bombarded all the time with the questions of who I am. So first it's Russia and being Jewish, but not being told Jewish. Then coming to Israel first time and coming to Kotel and not knowing anything, I'm sorry to say, about the Jewish history, because frankly, we were deprived from knowing, but then crying in front of Kotel for hours, not understanding how can I feel that this is something I know and this is my home when I have never been here and never heard of this place, right? And then moving to London in the age of 25 and having somebody suggest to me to come, somebody who is on the call now, I think, John, suggest to me to come for Friday night dinner just because he understood that I'm Jewish and I'm alone in town and I need, he needs to help me to be part of something. And all that feeling that I'm minority, that I'm Jewish, that I'm a newcomer to the country, every time you go through this process, and again, I don't have a special recipe. It's just the fact that when you're an immigrant and minority, you are faced with those questions because you just don't have a choice. You need to know, and it's from simple things to, I'm talking about big level ideas, right? About the questions of identity, but it also came down in London to which area I want to live in, which music do I like, who are my friends, who are not my friends, whether I can find the bread that I like in the supermarket or not. So it's being constantly asked those questions without any ability to avoid it. I think that led me to find some kind of formula of how you can go through that process more effectively and more purposefully to ultimately have what I think brings to your life meaning and energy and feeling that your life is, good and has the reason, and be in the position of explorer really and very comfortable. So I think that's kind of
and that was sort of embracing your Jewishness, as I understand it, and then effectively becoming Israeli, because of course, so the question of what does it mean to be Jewish is also not a simple one, right? So when you got to Israel, you didn't know Hebrew, right? You didn't know Jewish, you didn't know Hebrew, and now you're a Hebrew-speaking Jewish Israeli. So how hard, one of the points you make in your book is that being faced with such obstacles, being an outsider, can actually be a source of strength.
first of all, I have to say that I've always enjoyed the position of the outsider, because the position of the outsider allows you a lot of freedom to choose whether you want to follow the rules that are there or not, because you can, as an outsider, you can understand or not understand the rules. So for me, with my kind of revolutionary attitude sometimes to life, this was it was a blessing. In terms of coming to Israel, it was very funny, because on one level, I made a decision, a very not intellectual, rational decision, without the table, of pros and cons, to move to Israel, because I just felt that I have to live at home. That was my feeling. Never ever I thought that I'll do it so early in life. But when I came, I come from a certain environment, a Russian, former Soviet Union, Russia, more European, and this is the Middle East, and you had that experience yourself, and that's a very different culture. That's a culture which doesn't understand the boundaries and doesn't understand the distance, on both on physical and on psychological level.
Let me stop you there for 1 second. It's interesting you're saying that, because you and I have discussed this sort of society Israel, where somebody you don't know asks you how much money you make and so forth, and tells you to put a hat on your child. But it's interesting that you say it's Middle Eastern. I think of it as sort of the Eastern European ghetto culture that is affecting people. That's not how you see it?
You see, in the Eastern European ghetto, you're still, you have to put on a serious face and pretend that you are not emotional. Right? There is some level of distance emotionally. At least, I know it in our family. No one is a hugger, and it's very much, it's a very formal, and that part is non-existent in Israel. I think anyone becomes much warmer with sun and the sea. For me, it was quite a cultural shock. I have to say that I felt very much at home in Israel from the very beginning. However, you were very right. I had a profession. I kind of had my career figured out, and it's true. I'm saying that I hope no one is from my Jewish school in Moscow, because I did not learn any Hebrew, though we had Hebrew lessons, but I think I missed them all successfully, because I wasn't very good in school in going to all the lessons. And so this, for the first year of my life in Israel, people trained English on me. They figured I can speak English. They love training their English, and so what they'll do is that they'll speak English to me in whatever, and then I have Russian, and there's a million, people who speak Russian. So it took a lot of effort. It took a lot of learning in Ulpan and private teacher and you name it. And it also took a lot of effort to just stop it and say, now I'm going to pretend. And I did a lot of pretending. I'm ashamed to say that a lot of times I said to people, speak Hebrew to me, and I pretended I understand. I would understand because I understand, there is more than words in the conversation, right? But I will a lot of times not know what they talk about until, it took me a couple of years to learn and to be fluent in Hebrew. And I think that's one of the lessons that I learned, because it's ultimately whether I take responsibility for learning the language or whether I want to confine myself in the ghetto, which speaks the language of the country where I come from, right? And not learn. And by the way, having Russian and English, you can really get by in Israel without Hebrew. You know that. I mean, you don't really need it. And so that's always the question. And I think that's one of the things that I describe in the book. It's how you take it, ultimately. It's how you decide that you want to be a part of the bigger, but then you have to invest time and invest energy in learning the language and, not feeling yourself also perfect in a native language.
One of the points of your book is this, find the proper balance between roots and wings, but between tribe and globalism. And in some ways, Israel is sort of a very complicated example of this, right? Because it is the homeland of the Jewish people, but it's not limited to Jews. So its identity is complicated. You tell the story in your book about being outside Beit HaTfutzot, and we're going to get to talk in a few minutes about the museum, of an Arab woman complaining to you and saying, why is this just limited to Jews? And you're responding, well, I'll be happy to help you with an Arab museum if that's something you're interested in. So talk about that tension there in Israel, because of course, both things are real and issues.
So I'll go a little bit back from Israel, if you don't mind, a little bit of theory. So Stalin in the 40s coined the term ruthless cosmopolitan. It was, of course, a derogatory term towards the Jews, which it was a very clever way of, by the way, if he wouldn't be killed, we'll have I think much worse problem than the Holocaust, because I don't think he was that much better than Hitler, but he was not killed, sorry, died, and we're lucky for that. But the term ruthless cosmopolitan was trying to prove the concept that the person who doesn't have strong roots, doesn't have the loyalty to the country, and the Jews, because so mobile and really want to not be confined, not be limited to living in Soviet Union, they cannot be loyal to the Soviet ideals, right? Yeah. So my theory is not theory, my belief really is that in order for you to be able to truly be open-minded and liberal and accepting of other, there's one first and foremost rule for that, and you need to know who you are and you need to know what your roots are. So I suggest in the book the other term, which is rooted cosmopolitan, and this is how I feel myself. In other words, I think that the notion that I wasn't born today and I wasn't born 42 years ago and I was born thousands and thousands of years ago and I have a history before me that formed who I am, and I don't mean only family history, I also mean the history of my tribe, is something that allows me to be open-minded and accepting of others, because simply I have this, what I stand on. Now, and it's much like a tree, I put the tree on the book for a reason. It's much like a tree. You cannot imagine the tree with a lot of green leaves and very kind of healthy tree without having a very proper, strong root system. Now, the conversation with this Arab girl, which was pretty amazing, I think that every person and every tribe and every ethnic group deserves to be proud and know where they come from. I think absolutely everybody has to do that. I would really, and I will say that if I met her today, I will say that again. If I could help tell the story of the Arab people and tell the story in a way that will make them feel proud and belong and connected to their roots, I think that it will make Israel ultimately so much better, because you need to really, in order to be able to stand strongly, you need to really know who you are. But unless this story is told, and sometimes we forget, with all the desire to be universalists, we forget that we are blood and flesh and heart and not only brain, right? And we come from somewhere. So I don't think there is a way out of the situation and tension in Israel unless Jewish people feel strongly that where they come from and feel the pride, and then the Arab population, and this is right, by the way, not only about the Arab population, it's any minority, and trust me, I have legitimacy to talk about that because I was minority quite so many times, right? Until you know who you are and where you come from and you respect that, and I don't mean that you have to follow the traditions from the family, and I don't mean that you need to practice religion. I just mean that you need to be connected to where you come from. You can choose after that what you want to do with that. Not everything that you ate at home, your food, not everything that you ate is what you want to continue doing. You can also choose and say, I don't want to have to deal with it. That's not me. However, not knowing where you come from is what I think makes a person weaker and then makes more conflicts and crisis.
It's very, very profound what you're saying. One of the things you say in the book also is that you fear or sense that the European Union has sort of created too bland an identity, that there is a kind of a flattening of the national and tribal identities to something quote unquote European, and that you then say you wonder whether that has led to the rise of populist nationalists. You want to talk about that for a second? Because I think the question of how you slice, your tribal links to your universal is a very difficult one.
It's very difficult, but I was searching for what is the deepest, what is the strongest. By the way, identity, the word identity, it's the whole range of things that you explain to yourself and how you describe yourself to the world. We're talking about ethnic for many reasons here, but it's not only because we have a Jewish audience, but it's also because ultimately, if you look at that, the ethnic identity is the one that you cannot change. It's something that, and that's why I think that it's the strongest one and that needs to be properly developed and you need to feel connected to, because if you are born Italian, if you are born French, and if you're born Jewish, you will die all those things. Now, anything else can be changed now, almost anything else. You can change the religion, you can change the language, you can change the country, you can change the gender, anything. But try to figure out how you can change the ethnic identity. You really can't. So because of that, I think not relating to that or not taking it, and by the way, not making it a basic of the education in school and not explaining that connection is what very much weakens the people. Because and then all sorts of political things come into play, and then you have to, roots became also very political. So I think this notion of ethnic identity is very it's very important to consider. Now, European Union, as we all remember, was created as a result of a very difficult war and the desire to create something that will be a strong, solid unity, to never ever have to do that again. And then also, of course, as an anti to American power. But if you look at the difference for example, in ethnic identity in America, where you have the level of the ethnic, and then on that you have the American identity, but you still don't forget. I mean, I love this every time there is elections, and every time there's I read political sites naturally, and so you will have Italian congressman, Irish congressman, this conversation. So there is some sort of basis, which is an ethnic identity at the deeper level, and then there is an American dream. And I think in American identity, and then I think in the European, what happened was that the desire to blend and desire to create this pan-European and not to keep the ethnic is, I think, what created quite a weak foundation for the whole concept of European Union. And another thing that is bothering there is that it was created against something, not for something, and it's never a good way of building things. But I think you see how really hard it is to keep it together, because I think the foundation wasn't very healthy.
It's an interesting point. I mean, in other words, it sort of drains the blood from identity somehow, and it becomes a bloodless identity. So let's talk then about Beit HaTfutzot, about the museum that you have devoted yourself to. Again, in certain ways, you're an obvious candidate to be doing this, given the fact that you were brought up without a deep sense of being Jewish. And the museum, of course, was in some deep trouble after an early history of being a great place. Then it kind of fell onto hard times, and the government helped save it. But I think you and your father have played a big role. So talk about that process and what's important about it, because this idea of a Jewish people and its history is so central to what you're talking about.
So the story with the Museum of the Jewish People, and thank God we don't have to call it Beit HaTfutzot anymore, because I don't know who can pronounce that normally. You see, you are very practiced at that, and so am I, but frankly, it's really a difficult one. The first encounter with the institution was my father, who recently, just before that, we're talking about 2003, who after Mr. Putin rose to power, and we all see how that turned out, made Aliyah to Israel. And he was introduced to this museum by Ariel Sharon, then Prime Minister. And this place was in a very big trouble, I think mainly for the reason that it wasn't the paradigm that it was presenting to the world, was outdated. The idea, and it was created in the years in 50s and 60s and opened in the late 70s. And the idea that it presented was that there was a Jewish community and diaspora which contributed greatly to the establishment of the State of Israel, and now everyone should move to make Aliyah to Israel. Now we know how that turned out, and so I think by the time that we've met the museum, my father first in 2003, and then I joined later when I made Aliyah in 2008, it was from one hand a very outdated idea, because really at that point half of the Jewish people were not living in Israel and were not planning to, and I think that's I think they are right in that, as long as they live in a democratic society, which allows them to be Jewish, right? And so then came in question whether this place has a future or not. Now, the story of the Jewish people is usually told in a very, it's a very difficult story because we went through a lot of difficult times. However, I think the focus only on the difficult times is what makes it hard for the story to be able to, for our younger generation to be able to connect to that and to want to be Jewish, frankly, because if we only talk about what disasters we went through, and we went through the most, I'm not for a second saying we didn't. However, one of the reasons for anti-Semitism, which unfortunately is rising now, is usually our success. And so if we take that other part of the coin, whereby we flourished, we created, we established the state, we did so many great things for the world, but we are very careful in saying all those things because the moment we do, we're being hated, right? So there's this part of the story where we are great, but we're not telling that to our kids. Now, I don't think I can honestly explain to my 9 and 12-year-old why they should be Jewish if being Jewish is bad and, and it's difficult. So if we take it seriously, when the idea came up that you can tell the story of the Jewish people and you can focus not only on the difficulties, but also on the success, and also to not only focus on the past, but also talk about Jewish people now. And that's, by the way, that's where I came in, the bug in my system that I have to build this museum and we have to be part of it and it has to exist, was when I realized that the amazing Jewish world that we have of 15 million people globally, quite successful on any level and quite influential and impactful on any level, is not told anywhere. And most people do not get to have the perspective that some of us who travel or who are involved in the Jewish world have, which is that we are very, very fascinating people, amazing network of people, very strong one, but it's hard to put it, you need to put the map, you need to have this map of what you really belong to. And so that's when I became involved in 2008. I was reminded today that it's already 12 years. And from that moment...
Let me just interrupt for 1 second, because what you're saying I find very interesting, because it seems to me that you're saying that when you got involved in Beit HaTfutzot and the Jewish Museum, the Museum of Jewish People, the traditional notion of Zionism, which is Jews are the past and Israel is the present, you wanted to challenge that and to sort of create a more subtle relationship between the state of the Jews and the rest of the Jewish people, so that it wasn't, you're the losers, if you're going to be decent, you got to move here, but we've got this great state, you've got this great history, all of us have. Is that right? So it's a sort of a subtle shift of the Zionist narrative, it sounds to me.
I think so. Look, I have a picture here of the guy that I like the most, I think, Herzl, right? And so this it's Herzl 2.0, let's say, Herzl the hipster. That's the one I like. And so the idea that he had and the vision that he had was that, because there is a notion of B'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, Jews have to get the state, right? It was much influenced by the anti-Semitic environment and pogroms and everything. However, his vision was very positive and, by the way, very practical. If anyone wants to read the Jewish state, it's fascinating how precise he was and what needs to be done and how we need to go and establish the state. And so I think that once the state was established, what happened was that this people who were all in the same boat as it is minorities and immigrants. Suddenly, we have to deal with the fact that we now have part of the Jews who are born in Israel and who are majority. Now, being state of mind of majority and minority is very different. If people don't know that, I suggest they interview the friends, and it's a very different state of mind. And so I think that created sort of what the Jewish organizations now love to explore, the crisis and the shift and the rift between the different groups or the different geographies. However, if you look at Israel, the Israeli identity, the new Israeli identity, and it's very, very new thing that we have a state. It's we're not the youngest state. I think the South Sudan maybe the youngest, but I think we're one of the youngest states that exists. But the Israeli identity is actually built on this Jewish identity, right? It's not new from scratch. It's the continuation and it's the transformation. And so having that has to be a transformation to something new. So Jewish people have to transform into something new. But there is no question that we're still in the same boat, that we're still Jewish people. In crisis, we all know that we're ultimately, all the time we are reminded that we're the same Jewish people. Nobody really, differentiates between whether it's Israeli or Jewish American, whether it's Haredi, whether it's conservative, or whether it's somebody who doesn't want to define themselves by any labels, right? So now we have that new environment where we have 15 million people, of which 6, 7 live as a majority. But that doesn't mean that it stopped. It's just a new phase of the Jewish people, I think.
But the point is that instead of blaming those who haven't come and joined Israel, you're saying, let's hold hands and talk about what we have in common, right? And I think that, the technology that we're able to use right this minute to have this meeting in the middle of this pandemic is emblematic of a technological revolution of the last 2 to 3 decades that has allowed Israel to be its own nation and yet very well linked to the world. And I think that this global technology revolution has really helped Israel be what it has become, which is both more tribal than ever and more global than ever.
Absolutely. The technology just puts the emphasis on the things that existed before, on the tensions. I don't think the technology, it's changing the world, of course, but this notion of Jewish people being very colorful, very different, and having a very loving to blame the other for not being as ourselves, right? That part of Jewish history has been there with us forever. We remember Sfarad and Ashkenaz, we remember Babylon and Jerusalem. We're used to having 2 centers. That's one of the things we explore in the museum. So we have now 2 centers. Now this tension was always there. There was always somebody who was better, who did it wrong way. But this is what, when there is no tension like that, then there's also no creativity, and then there's also a new, unique thought. I don't think it's possible to imagine Jewish people without that tension. My only request from people is to see it for what it is, for the transition, and to try to make the best out of it, and not to focus much of why it happened and what it means, but to actually build towards something which is, again, joined. Because the last thing I'll say about it, we're only 15 million people. Everybody is an immigrant and minority. Whether you take France or Britain or any other country, only maybe China and India can allow themselves to feel themselves majority. But in the global world, 15 million people is a minority. So the idea of splitting for some reason where we have such a deep connection for so many thousands of years seems to me a bit of a mistake.
That's terrific. I think we're going to wrap up our one-on-one conversation, Irina, and welcome Dani back to the screen and eventually take questions from those who are listening. Dani, hi.
Hi, indeed, as expected, was an incredibly interesting conversation. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Irina. And I will ask the first question, but I was asked also to remind that those that want to ask questions, they have a Q&A tag in the bottom of their screen, and they are welcome to use it to forward questions. Irina, Ethan asked very interesting questions. Ethan is a journalist. Ethan is probably, don't get offended, conditioned to ask about today and probably tomorrow, the headline in tomorrow's newspaper. I'm not so interested about the headline, whether it is in the forward, the Jewish news outlet, or in, I don't know, Times of Israel or Yediot Achronot tomorrow about Israel, diaspora, Israel-world-Jewry relationship. But what virtually keeps me awake at night is the question, what will be written in the Jewish history book that will be written, let's say, in the year 2120, 100 years from now, or 2170, 50 years from now, about Jewish identity. And what keeps me literally awake at night sometimes is my fear that the historian that will write that book will say that in the 21st century, Jewish identity split. And actually the Jewish people, what was once called the Jewish people, became two separate tribes with a very extremely loose connection between them. Like you mentioned, the Italian Americans and Irish Americans, in the best case scenario, it may become hyphenated Jews, but even more than that. And there is a worse scenario. The worst scenario is that that book will say that one of the big Jewish tribes was lost. And the question is, what in your view, Irina, as a person that is so involved and, as I said, has such an incisive view about the Jewish identity, is what should we do in each side of the ocean, in Israel and in America, in order to prevent that from happening?
Oh, I wish I knew. Look, I think that we have to go much deeper in the conversation that we're having about it, and we have to bring together people to have a much deeper conversation with what are happening now. I don't want to complain about any things that are happening around the Jewish world is very energetic and talking about all the crises and all the issues, but I think ultimately the conversations stop at a very political level and a very superficial level, whereby people don't actually talk about the deeper issues, about the values, and about what it means to be Jewish and what it means to have the common roots. And they stop at their political views and how those are not in agreement with other. And I think that part is very worrying. And the second part is that we lack education, about what it means to be Jewish. And we lack education because, again, this topic became so political. So if I will sit here and I'll say to you that it's very important that we talk about the roots and our heritage, people will automatically assume that I belong to the right-wing movement. And if I'll say that you have to be open-minded, universal, and treat everybody equally, people will automatically assume that I am the left-wing. However, I think that the whole idea of political left and right, as much as it's what we know, I don't think it's actually that relevant anymore. I also strongly believe that you need to have both roots in order to be able to be open-minded, but the conversations stop at the political level. And I think until we get the conversation deeper and to what it means to be Jewish in a way that is inclusive, but truly inclusive, not for the sake of, political correctness, which currently is killing, currently what you see on the streets of the United States is very much connected to being politically correct before, right? Because the anger and frustration has to come out somewhere. So I think until there is a real conversation, a real deep conversation about our future together, which is not limited to the views and to the interests of people and for 2-3 years in power, but actually looks at 100 years and 100 we can't look anymore, but 20 years, right? And until this conversation becomes about the joint vision for us, I don't think anything can change. I think if we stay in this realm of superficial conversation and the role that Israel plays, and I mean the role as the role of the motherland of the Jewish people, whether you live there or not. You can have a conversation about the difference in political views with that or that government and stop there. You can also talk about the meaning of what it means for you, Israel, and where you come from and what your roots are. So I think unless the conversation and the education is on a different level, we're going to continue to have that conversation and distance ourselves and come to your worst case scenario of 2 separate tribes.
Shula has going to ask some questions from the listeners, but I just want to say one thing to Dani's question as well, and that is that I know there's a great concern of a growing divide between American Jews and Israel, but I think there is an argument that what's happened over the last 20 years and the globalization of the economy and the arrival of so many Israelis and Israeli culture in the United States is actually created the kind of cultural links that the museum wants to foster, and that would suggest less risk than what Dani said.
Right. Thank you so much for this fascinating conversation, very interesting conversation, which I know many people would love to receive and to contemplate further, since there were so many ideas. We also have hundreds of people on this call and many, many questions, and we have time to ask only a few. So one of the questions actually relates to the last part of the conversation, and that is, what do you see the crisis? What is the impact of the crisis on American Jewish-Israeli relations and Israel-Jewry relations? Do you think it will have an impact? We know that there are lots of requests for Aliyah, for example, to Israel. So Irina, if you can begin, and then Ethan, you may have your own perspective on the subject. So that's the first question.
I will say something that I'm not supposed to say. I don't know, and nobody knows. I can only sincerely hope. I think the Aliyah will of course increase greatly. That's easy to understand. It's a safer place. At least that Israel looks safer now. I think it will change dramatically the world. However, I don't think we can. I just hope for the Jewish people that we continue to want to be together. And I think we have it in our DNA. I'm less worried than Dani. I think we have it in our DNA to stick together. But I think actually what we make out of this crisis, and Jews are so good in making things, lemonade from lemons out of this crisis, is very much up to us. I don't think there is any power bigger than us ourselves to have results.
Eitan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Irina's honesty is pretty useful. Of course, it's very, very difficult. It's so early. In fact, we don't really know how this crisis is going to end, if it will end, and whether a vaccine, it'll depend on the timing of the crisis. We're facing this kind of fear for a year or two or three. It'll be different than if it's basically behind us in 6 months. On the Aliyah question, I will say that, of course, because of the lockdown, there's been virtually no Aliyah over the last few months, and there will be a burst of it, obviously, in the coming year, both because of the pent-up amount that didn't get to go, and as Irina points out, that Israel looks like a pretty safe place from a health point of view right now.
There is another question to Irina, and that is, what do you want the takeaway from your book to be? What do you want people to remain with? What kind of, not just thoughts, but what kind of action would you like to see people make?
I think, first of all, that if people would agree with my view of the identity, which is, there are a couple of notions. One, that identity is the process, and it's on you to ask yourself those questions. First, understand that identity consists of many, many, many layers, but there is a deeper level, which is an ethnic level, which you have to deal with, whether you like it or not, and understand that when you try to understand the history of your family, and I gave that example in the book, once I realized that asking my grandfather a question about him is not because I want to be nice to him and let him talk and feel himself good, but actually whatever he tells me enriches my understanding of who I am, life became totally different. Search for yourself and identity and the roots is a very egoistic and very, very enriching process. But I think there are two parts to the identity. One is that it's on you to go through that process and to ask yourself questions and to never ever let it go, frankly, if you want to grow and if you want to develop and if you want to have an interesting and meaningful life. Second, that the question of belonging is crucial, where you belong. And that's why I'm in the museum, because where you belong on a real level, not which Facebook group that you belong to, and not what kind of puppies you like, but actually where you belong really on a deep level is a question that you need to explore. And also, I think that to try to understand that immigrants are role models for the new world, especially in crisis, immigrants and the way that the immigrants are, where people are used to looking at immigrants as a weaker part with lack of resources. However, I think immigrants and minorities are in the position to teach a lot of people about how you build resilience and how you build your life in the way that allows you to flourish and to, and go through the crisis in a much more comfortable manner. What I want to see as a result, I would love to see the identity lectures and identity questions be part of the school curriculum from the very beginning. I would love for people to understand that this topic is the most important topic. The question of who you are is going to be, whatever you do is going to be the most important question that you have to answer yourself every day. And so whatever people do with that, I'll be happy to help, by the way, because that's what I'm here for. But I just hope that, and the fact that, and the skills that immigrants have, that people understand that the skills, they can learn these skills. This is learnable to live a better life.
Thank you, Irina. There is one last question, though there are many, many questions which I will send to you and to Ethan, but we don't have really the time to go through them all. There is one specific question that relates to the role of Bet HaTfutzot at this moment in time when people cannot necessarily get to Israel as often as they would want to. How can, and may not be able to see the museum as it is now, what can Bet HaTfutzot do in order to bring the museum, the school, and other dimensions, other platforms that it has worldwide?
So first, we do that. We do that with a lot of webinars. We do it with the virtual exhibit. Second, I really hope that eventually we'll be able to travel in some way or another, and then you'll be able to see this amazing place. But third, I think we'll have to move in a new era and understand how our job is to get people to connect to who they are and to strengthen their feeling of belonging to Jewish people. So we'll have to do a lot of work now to see how we can deliver this content to the organizations and to people like we do now online.
Thank you so much. I want to really conclude my part and to thank the hundreds of people who joined us today, to thank Ambassador Dani Dayan for hosting this event, to thank you, Irina, and you, Ethan, for a really wonderful, interesting conversation, and to thank the President and the CEO of the Center of Jewish History for hosting us via Zoom and providing us with a great team to really put this program together. So Bernie, without further ado, I want to thank you for the partnership, and hopefully we'll partner on many more programs in the future. Bernie, your last word.
Thank you, Shula. Thank you very much. I just want to say a few words here before we close. First of all and foremost, what a wonderful program this was. Oh my goodness. Thank you, Irina, for sharing with us those remarkable and insightful comments and ideas. For those of us who have read the book, it really adds an extra level of depth. For those of you who haven't read the book, I can't imagine what you're waiting for. Go and read the book today. Ethan, I want to thank you very much for guiding us through this conversation. Of course, thank you to Ambassador Dani Dayan. I also quickly want to thank our team here at the Center for Jewish History for their great work, Julie Kaplan, Alana Rosenbluth, and Dr. Malgorzata Bakalarz-Givaje. Ethan had spoke, and Irina had spoke somewhat about the split between the American Jews and the Israeli Jews, and I can say there is no split between the Center for Jewish History and the Beit HaTfutzot, the Museum of the Jewish People. We are proud to work together again with Irina, with Shula, and with Beit HaTfutzot. The missions of our two organizations are very complementary, similar, they're related. We here in New York house one of the largest collections of artifacts and documents related to the history of Jewish people outside of Israel. And of course, Beit HaTfutzot has their remarkable, vast, and unique collection and set of exhibits in Tel Aviv. But together we do much the same thing. We tell stories. And the stories we tell are the beautiful and wonderful and sad and amazing and unique stories of the Jewish people. And today I think we saw Ethan and Irina particularly, thank you. We saw just a beautiful, beautiful way of telling those stories. For those of you who want to find out more about what it is that the great people of Beit HaTfutzot do and the wonderful team here at the Center for Jewish History do. And for those of you who would like to help support us, you can go find both of our wonderful organizations on the web, beth.bh.org.il, and us here at the center at cjh.org. Again, thank you all for your time, your patience. This has been a wonderful program. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.